Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. My grandma lived to be 99 years old and passed away about 8 years ago. I'm now in my 40s, and to this day, I've never quite felt a connection with another human being as I did with her. My wife was around 2 months pregnant with our first child when I received word that my grandma wasn't doing well. I was crushed that she likely wouldn't be able to meet my firstborn. At this point, I lived across the country from where my grandma was, and I had just started a new career. My mom told me my grandma had developed severe dementia and suggested it was okay to stay home and prioritize my new life responsibilities rather than seeing her in such a state. I ultimately decided to stay home to help my pregnant wife. My grandma held on for a couple of months, then passed away. A few months later, our son was born. Now, this is an important detail for later. My son has these insanely piercing bright blue eyes and platinum blonde hair. Fast forward 6 months, and one night I'm in my son's room trying to get him to sleep. He was lying in his crib when he suddenly turned his head to look up toward the corner of the ceiling, as if startled, then began laughing hysterically, so hard that he could barely catch his breath. I followed his line of sight, looking up there, but there were no pictures or decorations, just a blank wall in that corner of the room. The next day it happened again. So I went to get my wife from the other room to show her how hard he was laughing. She told me he had been doing the same thing all week while I was at work. It became a regular occurrence, happening multiple times a day, and it started to feel a bit creepy because he was clearly seeing something up there. A couple of months later, my mom came to visit. One night, as she was helping me get my son ready for bed, we got into a conversation about my grandma's last days, specifically how her dementia had worsened over time, except for one specific day. Here's the first twist. She tells me that one day she went to visit my grandma, who was in bed with a huge smile on her face, her feet dancing back and forth. It was the first somewhat normal conversation they had in about a month. "Mom, wow, you're so happy today." "Grandma, yeah, my friend came to visit me again." "Mom, who's that?" "Grandma, the boy with the seahorses." "Mom, oh, is he a boy visiting someone in the nursing home?" "Grandma, no, he lives in there." Then she pointed to the corner of the room near the ceiling. To humor her, my mom asked what he looked like. "Grandma, the boy with the blue eyes and white blonde hair. He's going to visit me every day now." At this point, my jaw was practically on the floor. She proceeded to tell me that from that day forward, all my grandma would talk about was this blue-eyed blonde boy with seahorse friends who lived on a tropical island inside the wall and visited her daily. I then told my mom about my son's giggling episodes with the ceiling, and we were both shocked at the coincidence. I asked what was with the seahorses, but my mom had no clue, and neither did I. I want to believe that my grandma and son shared some sort of otherworldly connection, but the rational side of me thought dementia affects people strangely. Babies do weird stuff, and the seahorses and tropical island part seemed nonsensical. But here's the second twist, and it's hard to deny after this. Fast forward to when my son was roughly 4 and a half. Out of the blue, he began talking about a place called Stelladin, where he used to live before he was born. This is my best interpretation of how to spell it. He said Stelladin was like a planet, not near Earth, where people could fly and animals could talk, along with many other details. I listened to his stories and was just happy he had such a big imagination. At this point, I had completely forgotten about the seahorses. One day, I was going through an old photo album and saw a picture of my grandma. I called my son over to see the picture. This was the first time I had ever shown him a picture of her. He looked at it and said, "I know her. She's my friend from Stelladin." My hair stood on end. I asked him to tell me more about her, and he said, "She came over and ate orange fruit with me and my seahorses on my island while I lived there." I burst into tears as all the details from my mom's story flooded back. The probability of all this being a mere coincidence seems almost impossible. I don't know what it all means, but I'm grateful to finally share this. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. I grew up in an 8-bedroom farmhouse with my dad until I eventually moved out. We always had extra rooms that weren't being used, and because of the age of the house plus all the extra space, there was always an eerie feeling, like someone was lurking in the shadows. If I needed a drink in the middle of the night, I'd keep my eyes on the ground the entire time, afraid of what might be watching me from the dark corners, rooms, or hallways. Even windows and mirrors were off limits. I was never sure what I might see looking back at me. When I was around 12 years old, I started wondering why the room that used to be my nursery was locked from the outside. Before then, I hadn't thought much of it. My dad used it for storage, and I figured he just wanted to keep me out. But one day, I asked him what was so important in it that it needed to be locked, especially since I was no longer a child, typical 12-year-old thinking. It turned out my assumption about the lock was only partly correct. With a serious expression, my dad sat me down and answered my question. While I was a baby, about 1 or 2 years old, I slept in that nursery on the second floor, right next to my dad's room. My sister had painted the room especially for me with Winnie the Pooh characters and fluffy clouds. A sweet, creative effort I still appreciate. I even have a photo of myself smiling at Pooh Bear on the wall while we were setting it up. Anyway, I stayed in that nursery in my crib, perfectly at the age where I could sleep in my own room. But every night, my dad was woken up by me screaming and crying. Having raised 4 children before me, he wasn't prone to first-time parenting mistakes. He figured it might be the change from sleeping in his room to sleeping alone that unsettled me. He even considered moving my crib back into his room, but the nursery was set up and ready. So when I cried in terror, he would come in and check on me, finding no problems like temperature, hunger, or needing a diaper change. He'd stay with me until I fell asleep or keep the light on to help me feel safe, then return to his room for some rest. One night, tired of the nightly disruption, he decided to sleep on the floor of my nursery to see if he could find the cause of my distress, or, at the very least, get some rest. I was able to sleep peacefully with him there. but he, lying uncomfortably on the hardwood floor, was unable to settle. Then, as he lay there, boom, 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 3 massive blows struck the floorboards directly beneath him, as if someone below was hammering up at him from the first floor. Startled, he jumped to his feet, instinctively rushing downstairs to check for intruders. Being logical and brave, he was ready to defend us. But when he got downstairs, the lights were off, doors and windows were locked, and no one was there. The nearest neighbor was a quarter-mile down the road, and why would they break in just to bang on the ceiling? And with such precision, the force of those blows wasn't normal. After that, my dad moved my crib back into his bedroom, and I was finally able to sleep without screaming or crying, except for the usual needs of a baby. He brought a Bible into the nursery for good measure, and cast out any evil he thought might have invited itself in. From then on, the nursery was locked up and only used for storage, and my dad only went in during the daytime. That old lock is still on the door, as if a lock could keep spirits in. Unable to rationalize the event, he chose to leave it in the past. We believe whatever entity was in there was malicious, and that my dad's attempt to protect me only made it angrier. As I grew up in that house, I had trouble sleeping alone in any room. Many nights, I'd end up on the couch in the living room watching Disney until I finally dozed off. But even then, I never felt entirely comfortable. There were always eyes on me. While there were many other strange occurrences in the farmhouse, this was my dad's most direct encounter with something truly evil. The scariest moment of my life happened when my friend and I were camping in eastern Washington as teenagers. We decided to sleep in an abandoned camper we found deep in a large forest near our town. It had been there so long that small trees had grown around it. We'd stumbled across it a few months earlier while exploring and thought it would be cool and brave to sleep there for a night. So one weekend we did. We arrived after dark because we'd gotten lost trying to find the camper. Our flashlight was dim, making it even harder to see. When we finally found it, we opened the rusty door and stepped inside. The sounds echoed shrill and unsettling. Typical camper stuff was scattered around: cups, empty cans, swollen Western novels. Already tired, we settled at one end of the camper where the bed area used to be, before the cushions had rotted away to almost nothing. A long hallway stretched down the length of the camper, so we could see from end to end. It was a miserable night. Several rats were living in there. I saw them staring at us from a chewed-out part of the ceiling. When the wind blew outside, the camper would shriek and groan. At one point, we thought we heard a bear walking around outside. Still, we pretended to be brave and acted like we were having fun, but we were tense. At some point, I woke up from an uncomfortable sleep. I sat up to readjust when I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. At the other end of the camper was a small window, and through it, I saw a man's silhouette staring right at me from outside. At first, I thought it was a weird shape from a tree or something, but when I moved a bit to get a better look, the person reacted slightly, then froze. My heart was racing as I shook my friend awake, whispering, "Someone is here, over there," over and over, never taking my eyes off the figure. My friend woke up quickly, and I nodded toward the window. He saw him too. We whispered frantically about who it could be, and why he was staring at us. For the next 10 minutes, no exaggeration, we stared him down. The longer we stared, the more frightened we became. Occasionally he'd move, but he kept his eyes locked on us. Finally I shouted, "Hey," but there was no reaction. My friend, braver than me, decided to shine the flashlight at him. As soon as he did, we realized our horrible mistake. It wasn't a window on the other side of the camper. It was a mirror. We had been staring at ourselves the whole time. Completely ridiculous. Still, it was the most terrifying, relieving, and funniest moment of my life. Closest I've ever come to a paranormal experience. My family has a farm that's pretty isolated. There are other houses nearby, but most of them are abandoned. I spent a winter break there alone while I was 17. I would be alone from Monday to Friday, and my dad and brother would come on the weekends. As it was a Christmas school break, I had some free time. I had some meat in a smoker next to the house, which is like a separate shed with a pizza oven where we smoke dry the meat and store logs, and wood for the fireplace in the house. Anyway, it's around 3:00 a.m. It's a winter night, and it's been snowing for a few days. The first layer of snow has frozen, and the wind is blowing new snow on top of it. As I'm walking from the house to the smoker, I'm admiring the noise it makes, kind of like pouring sugar into a bowl. I stop for a moment, enjoying the sound. I check on the fire in the smoker, make sure it's out, grab some more firewood for the house, and then head back inside. I lock the door, drop the firewood next to the furnace, and step out on the porch to put the ashes from the fire into the bin. And then I hear it silence. Complete and utter silence. At first, I think maybe it stopped snowing, but the snow is still falling the same way it was a minute ago. Immediately, I feel something is wrong. I turn my head, feeling a sudden wave of fear, and the hairs on my neck and arms stand up. Then I hear a faint sound, like a lullaby. A woman singing softly as if to lull a baby to sleep. It's quiet and distant, but it's the only sound I can hear. I stand there frozen, unable to move. The song seems to be echoing from the woods, but also somehow around the house. I can't tell where it's coming from, and I don't expect anyone to jump out, but I still feel uneasy. I run into the house, locking myself in the bedroom. The house is near the woods, it's been snowing, and it's 3:00 a.m. No one would ever come close to the house at this hour. I'm creeped out and unable to sleep. I locked myself in the bedroom and stay there until morning. Nothing happened, and I didn't hear the sound again. When I think about it, the sound stopped as soon as I ran inside. When my dad came a few days later, he'd spend the weekends with me and then go back to work on Mondays. He just shrugged it off, saying it might be time to head home. I went back with him that Monday and have never spent a night alone in that house since. A few months later, I found out what really happened. The farm is in a small village, mostly populated by elderly people, some of whom live alone with no family nearby. That winter, an old lady went missing, but no one reported it since she had no family or friends who would notice. She lived in a small house on the far side of the forest, with no electricity. She most likely had a stroke or needed some other kind of help, and she tried to make her way through the woods toward our house. Since the lights at our house were on, it would have been visible from a distance. so maybe that's why she came toward it. Additionally, since my great-grandmother had once been like a village doctor, she may have remembered her and sought help. Unfortunately, the old woman got lost in the woods, unable to call out, and fell into a hole like a dried-up river basin, where she became trapped and passed away. She was found a few months later in the woods, approximately 2 miles from our house. I'll never forget the sound I heard that night, and how much it resembled an old lullaby. I'm not sure if it was because of her condition, or if I somehow imagined it, but I was definitely not okay for some time afterward. I used to be a supervisor doing trauma scene cleanup work about 20 years ago. We handled everything from homicides, unattended deaths, explosions, fires, and accidents. I have a few stories, but I won't make this a super long post. Being on 24-hour call, we get emergency calls at all hours. One night past midnight, we received a call about a house fire. The fire was already put out, but we were called to remove debris from public view, board up the property, and make sure everything was as safe as possible. It was reported that the family suffered multiple deaths in the fire, so we had to secure the scene for investigators. Once we arrived, we saw the house at the end of a cul-de-sac, a large 2-story house in a nice neighborhood. My partner and I got to work immediately. Our first task was to board up the openings cut by the firefighters. The interior was very dark since, as with every fire, the electricity had been cut off. We normally carried old 6-volt lanterns and hammers hatchets on our work belts. Inside, it was still very hot, and debris was everywhere. My partner, Jake, was a big football player type, so I always knew that if we ran into trouble, we'd have each other's backs. We started boarding up a large sliding door in the back of the house, just off the kitchen. We both kept stopping and looking around, doing so without mentioning it to each other, until we finally exchanged glances and said, "Did you see that?" We'd been seeing shadows moving behind us, but whenever we turned around or shined our flashlights, nothing was there. We began working faster, frequently glancing over our shoulders, until we heard a noise from upstairs. Now, you have to understand, it's not uncommon for kids or people to enter unattended burned-out structures. Sometimes it's out of curiosity, other times to see what they can steal. Assuming we'd either confront kids or someone trying to take from the family, we grabbed our lights and hammers and went upstairs. We cleared each room, starting with the one closest to the top of the stairs. Jake would enter a room while I stayed in the hallway, and we'd switch off until we came to a bathroom at the end of the hall. At that point, we figured we just heard settling noises from the fire. After all, most of the roof and ceiling were gone, leaving only rafters above, and the fire had been so intense that much of the upstairs was almost burned off from midway up the walls to the roof. We made our way back downstairs and started working on another window when once again, we heard another noise from upstairs. This time it didn't sound like settling. It sounded like something dragging, accompanied by footsteps. We continued working until we heard noises again from upstairs, this time sounding like a door closing. Jake and I exchanged looks and said, "Okay, let's go." We headed back upstairs, searching room to room, checking closets under beds, every inch of space a person could be, nothing. We went back downstairs to continue working, but we kept hearing noises from upstairs, and still saw shadows moving around us. Our final task was to secure the front door. With all the other downstairs openings secured, we shut the front door and began securing it when all of a sudden, someone started banging on the door from inside. I turned to Jake, but he was already running toward the truck. I grabbed our stuff and ran after him. By the time I reached the truck, he was already backing out of the driveway. I jumped in, and we drove about a mile down the road, while I yelled over to him that the back roll-up door was still open. He replied, "Forget that. I'm not stopping." I was working in Kuwait on an old military base, about 20 miles outside of Iraq. The base had been overrun by Iraq during the first Gulf War. I'm not sure how many died at the base, but the Kuwaiti generals were hanged by the Iraqi military on the base flagpoles, while the remaining staff were lined up outside the old building of the Kuwaiti Officer Club and shot to death by the Iraqis. Eventually, the base was taken back with the help of the U.S. military. All around the base, there were these small buildings we worked out of from time to time. I was an aviation mechanic. Apparently, back in the day, they served as bomb-proof hangars for fighter jets and storage. When the U.S. and its allies reclaimed it, they bombed the base with bunker busters, and it turned out the hangars weren't as bomb-proof as they had thought. What's left now are hangars with gigantic holes on top of them, about 12 feet of concrete and rebar torn apart. The insides of the hangars were a mess, just what you expect from something that had been blown up. Our location was particularly secluded and quiet, and at times, I would be the only one there. One night, my crew loaded up to go get food, and I had to stay behind as I was in the middle of a job. While working, I heard something that sounded like footsteps in the sand behind me. Imagine the Kuwait desert as a beach with no water. I turned around thinking one of my crew had come back, so I asked, "Forget something." But when I looked, there was nothing there. I shook it off and continued working. A few minutes later, I heard movement in the sand again, but this time it sounded like running. I instantly thought my crew was messing with me, so I turned around, expecting to be tackled or put in a headlock, as we often joked around that way. But again, I turned around to nothing. There wasn't much else I could do, so I just ran into the hangar. When the crew returned with food, I told them what had happened. They called me crazy, and we all laughed it off. A few nights later, a similar situation occurred, but this time I wasn't alone. My supervisor was with me. We both heard running footsteps, and then we heard screams coming from the direction of the hangar. We knew for a fact that we were the only ones there. Over time, we all began experiencing similar situations. The most common things were the footsteps running in the sand, our names being called by no one, and the screams. Once my supervisor was listening on the radio, waiting for a plane to land, when he suddenly heard a woman crying. He threw the headset down and ran over to me, saying, "Dude, I think I'm losing my mind." I remember his face was pale and he looked genuinely scared. Mind you, he was not the type to admit being frightened. We didn't tell anyone else about it. About a week later, our logistics clerk was in the office ordering parts over the phone. Suddenly she screamed, throwing the phone, shouting, "What in the world? There's a lady crying on the phone." My supervisor looked at me and then told her about what he'd heard on the radio. We didn't really know how to react, to be honest. I think we were relieved that we weren't going crazy and that it was happening to everyone. I grew up in a large city in eastern Canada. The whole of my life at that point had been spent around noise and light, traffic and tides of people. It made the concept of quiet solitude very appealing, and I'd learned to seek these things out and appreciate them whenever I could. So when the opportunity arose to visit my parents' home, I took it. They grew up in the far eastern part of Canada, on the island of Nova Scotia. Not from the big city there, but from a small town. One of those towns you can see by standing on the biggest street within it. A remote part of a remote island in a remote country seemed like gold to me, especially at that time in my life. I was in my early 20s. I'd shotgun straight out of college, aimed at a career, intent on making my mark. But the city I was in wasn't particularly accepting of my skills or the language I spoke. So finding work was difficult and depressing. I gained a lot more than I should have. I ate more. I drank more. Everyone thought it was a good idea for a change of pace. Healthy even. Of the trip, I will only describe our descent, for it is the most opportune use of the word. If you've never been in a small plane at night, flying above a sea of clouds during a full moon, then you were missing one of the few plane-based pleasures available to people in the era of human flight. It's magical. The sky looked like wet black tarmac and headlights. So many stars, there seemed to be more than the sky could hold. Hovering in the middle of them was this spotlight of a moon, almost too bright to look at. These things together lit the rolling clouds beneath the plane. It looked like pillow stuffing spread out horizon to horizon, all cast in a silver blue light. It felt like I could walk on it, like it was only a few feet below the fuselage. It moved and breathed and changed as we flew over it. It really is a perfect memory. Then we dove down through that perfection into darkness. We arrived at a small airport outside their hometown. We could have driven from Halifax, but elected not to. Overnight driving in Nova Scotia is perilous for people not accustomed to small roads and wildlife that still remains mostly wild. If your car hits a moose at 60 km/h, the moose won't be what gets scraped off the road. We still had some driving to do, though. Their hometown was not where we would be staying, but a cabin that had been in the family for years, about 30 minutes away in the woods. My lifestyle back on the mainland, fueled by disappointment and depression, had given me two things I couldn't shake while I landed: a desire to be outside and a completely messed up internal clock. I was so used to playing Ultima Online until 4:00 a.m. every night that 2:00 a.m. felt pretty early. So when my parents went to bed, I let them know I was going for a walk. They understood, and Nova Scotia is not known for violent crimes in the woods, so there was no real concern. I took a flashlight and a walking stick, mostly to avoid turning an ankle and for swatting away any unwanted attention from local fauna. Not that a broomstick would do much against an aggressive animal, but if you've ever gone walking anywhere not fully tamed, it just feels good to have something solid in your hands. So off I went. Now, ever since our descent, I've been experiencing this general sense of tension. I attributed it to a new place, No real creature comforts except some books and a lack of computer. Maybe it was just the absence of that amazing scene above the clouds. Whatever it was, that feeling ratcheted up several levels just a few minutes from the house. I shelved it. I figured I'd acclimate shortly. And this was a clearly defined walking path that I knew circled around the small lake next to the cabin and would bring me right back there in a couple of kilometers. Probably a 45-minute walk if I kept a good pace, an hour if I was a bit more casual. The whole way around, I would be able to see the cabin, so I wouldn't lose my orientation. All in all, I'm trying to say I had my bases covered. I even had light, as the moon I'd seen earlier was still overhead, poking out from the overcast sky regularly enough to see. The clouds were fast, as they can be so close to the sea. So I'm walking down the path, woods to my right, thick, impenetrable pine, and to my left, the small lake, like glossy black frosted glass by the wind and the moon. Solo walks are great for thinking, so I let my mind wander. The path was well kept, and the stick and flashlight were utterly unnecessary. At some indeterminate point in the walk, I felt someone walk over my grave. You know those slow chills when you can feel the wave of goosebumps appear, fingering up your back, neck, forearms, and everything goes tight. I realized I was staring at the lake, at the white noise of the reflective light, and not paying attention to the woods. I became irrationally certain that something terrible was in the woods. I flicked on my flashlight as I turned to look, and it was like sinking in a hot tub. The goosebumps vanished, and the woods seemed utterly unremarkable. Mollified, I continued walking. Then it happened again, the exact same feeling. Once more, I realized I was absent-mindedly staring at the lake, wondering if my house was going to go IDOC in UO. I remember that specifically. At this point, I noticed the cabin almost directly across from me, beyond the lake. I am as far as I'm going to get from the house during my walk, and all I want is to be back there with one of my books. As this thought crosses my mind, I noticed that a small part of the reflection on the lake is missing. It's just gone, like someone went over it with a Sharpie. So I look at that spot, focus on it. Of all the bad decisions in my life, that's the one I would wish to take back the most. Even while my Homo sapien brain is trying to assign some reason for this absence of reflection. Half-sunk boat, bed of reeds, weird stone outcropping. My lizard brain is telling me to get away as fast as I can. The spot is getting bigger. It is something man-shaped walking out of the water toward me, very clearly walking, backlit by the moon. I'm frozen. I can't move. It's getting close to shore when I realize I still have a flashlight. One of the big ones people in cabins like to keep around. I dropped my stick and fumbled with the flashlight, not breaking eye contact with this thing. I find the switch, which was right where it should be, under my thumb, but hey, panic, and shine it at this man shape. Of course, there's nothing there at all, just water and moonlight, reflections all the way back to the cabin. I swear I stood there for 5 minutes, motionless except for my eyes, which recrossed, searching the entire lake. Finally, I decide I'm imagining things, despite every inch of me still screaming to run. I resolve to head back the way I came, at double speed. I flip the light switch off to get my night vision back. The thing is exactly where it would be if it hadn't stopped approaching, right where I had been pointing my light. Close enough now to start obscuring part of the cabin, literally visible in the dark, but not in the light. I froze for some amount of time, probably only a few seconds, but it felt like a lot longer. It got closer, like water moves noisily, but regularly. You watch reflections on it, and it's just noise. There are no regular waves or anything. It's just a constant shimmer. The edges of this thing were like that. It was hard to notice at first, because just the lake was behind my view of it. But as it eclipsed the cabin and some of the ground, I very clearly saw its edges move just like the lake. Some people have described it as scribbles. Some have called it static. I feel like these are synonymous descriptions of what I saw. At about 10 feet, I realized there wasn't going to be any kind of stopping. It wasn't going to stop and say something or resolve itself into some drunk person or anything I wanted to deal with. So instead of panicking, I dropped the flashlight. I heard it break and sprinted back to the cabin. I fell once, skinning my shin pretty roughly, but made it back to the cabin in about 10 minutes. I wasn't in great shape. I returned to the house. My head was pounding, ears roaring, and I felt nauseous. I stumbled in and collapsed into the downstairs bedroom. 2-floor cabin, parents upstairs. They were undisturbed by my noisiness, and I collapsed into bed. Then I noticed my one window was framing the lake like a painting. Everything just outside the window was pitch black moon on the other side of the house. I decided I couldn't deal with that, so I went back out to the main room and closed all the doors and windows I could see and slept on the sofa. At some point, hours later, crashing from the adrenaline and the run, I fell asleep. The next morning, my parents woke me up coming downstairs. They asked me why I was sleeping on the couch, fully clothed, and why my jeans were ripped. I was too self-conscious at this point to say anything close to the truth, so I just said I fell, lost a flashlight, and had to come back and just fell asleep on the couch by accident. They bought it. I didn't sleep well or much at all. So I decided to go to actual bed and get some actual sleep. I walked over, opened the door to my room, and lying perfectly aligned on the bed was a broken flashlight covered in dirt and the brimstone, side by side like matchsticks. The window was locked. I'm a nurse. Story number 1. I had just graduated from nursing school and started my role as the charge nurse on the medical surgical unit when this incident occurred. On our med-surg unit, the night shift charge nurse takes the same patient load as all the other nurses. On the first night of my weekend trio of shifts, I assigned myself a patient called Mrs. F. Mrs. F was a morbidly obese lady with a small bowel obstruction who had refused to have an NG tube placed to help drain her stomach. No big deal really, since she was ordered to have nothing by mouth, no food or drink, and wasn't experiencing any nausea or vomiting at the time. She seemed as sane as you and me. Anyway, I got the creepiest feeling from her that Friday night for some reason. She mentioned how she usually talks to her dead mother, which I don't think is strange at all. Still, she gave me an uneasy feeling. Fast forward to the next night. For some reason, she had changed rooms, so I didn't mind assigning her to another nurse. At one point during the night, she pressed the call button. I couldn't understand what she said over the intercom, so I walked down to her room to see what she needed. She wanted some water, so I went and got her some. When I returned to the room, she told me something that I found awfully peculiar. I can remember exactly what she said. "They had a party for me today." I asked, "Who did?" She replied with a huge smile on her face, "My friends and family. Some I haven't seen in 20 years. I said, "Wow, they must have come from far away." I know my eyes widened when she clarified, "No, they have been dead for that long." It was the most beautiful party. It really made me wonder why a 40-something-year-old, seemingly sane woman would say something like this. I got my answer about 2 hours later, when a white-faced coworker walked out of Mrs. F's room and yelled that we needed to call a code. It was too late for Mrs. F. It looked like she had died at least 30 minutes before we found her. I immediately understood what she meant by her party. It must have been a going-away party. Story number 2. It was a pretty slow night on the med-surg floor. There were only 2 of us working on the 3rd floor, another nurse and myself. The 3rd floor ends with a window to the outside on one side, and locked double doors to the labor and delivery ward on the other. I was in the room closest to the L and D ward, in the B side of the room. The bed was empty. I was fiddling with my patient IV pump. The curtain dividing the room was pulled. I didn't think much about it. I heard rustling and footsteps around B, as I thought it was the other nurse getting the bed ready for an admission that they must have called about while I was busy. I said, "Are we getting one?" No answer. I yanked the curtain back, and nobody was there. The bed was empty, and I looked at it confused. I stepped out of the room and saw the other nurse way down at the nurse's station, doing her charting just like I had left her. I called out, "Were you just in here?" She said no. I asked if anyone else was on the floor except for us. Another no answer. I never figured out who or what was right beside me on the other side of the curtain. Story number 3. This story takes place on the same floor as the 2 stories above. I had a patient admitted to our unit to die. It always made me sad for patients to die alone with no family. So I put an oxygen saturation monitor on him to alarm once his saturation dropped below 50 or 60%. I can't remember which specifically. Anyway, I was doing rounds and opened his door to peek in on him. The room was dark and the hall light was on, so naturally, my shadow was cast on the wall opposite me. That particular night, I was working with a very tall, very stout coworker. While I was peeking in, a very large, tall shadow in the shape of a person covered mine on the wall. I spun around, thinking that my fellow nurse was behind me, but there was nobody. Story number 4. I happened to be working in the psych unit one night with 2 nursing assistants. We were all sitting at the front end of the hall charting, talking, etc. We all heard what could be described as something being dropped. One of the assistants got up and made her way down the hall to try to find the source of the noise. She found everyone in the 12-bed unit fast asleep. We heard the noise again, this time louder. I took off this time, determined to figure out what was going on. I briefly noted a pair of sneakers on the floor in a room to my left. I walked on, peeking into rooms, when I heard the noise again, louder and behind me. I turned around quickly and walked back toward the room with the sneakers on the floor. This time, they were both in different positions. The patient in that bed was still fast asleep. It couldn't have been him throwing the shoes around, because he required maximum assistance to transfer to bed. I ran as fast as I could down the hall back to the nursing assistants, and wouldn't go anywhere by myself for the rest of the night. Story number 5. Once again, I was on the med-surg floor, sitting at the desk with my coworker, not long after shift change. The floor was very light that night, with only about 5 patients. There were 2 men in a room together to the left of the nurse's station, and 3 ladies in separate rooms to the right. All of a sudden, a loud and angry male voice was heard by my coworker and me. "Kristen," he growled. We looked at each other, terrified with white eyes, and practically ran into the room with the 2 male patients. We startled them coming in so fast. One was texting away on his cell phone, while the other was flipping channels. We asked which one of them yelled. Neither had. We checked all the other patients, all ladies, mind you, and they said they hadn't called out. We went through all the empty rooms and found nothing. Another night, not long after that, another nurse and I heard loud sobbing. We checked all the rooms and found nobody crying. Story number 6. I'm a home health nurse now, and this happened a few years ago. I was going to a patient's house that I had never visited before. I pulled up to what looked like the main entrance, a screen and window to the side of the house. There were tall shelves against the windows in that room. I noticed the figure of a cat walking across the tops of the shelves pretty quickly, toward the screen door that I was about to open. So, not wanting to let the cat out, I decided to go to the front door instead. I walked around the house to the front door, and the man who answered, the patient, looked a bit confused that I used that door instead of the one I pulled up to. I explained that I didn't want to let the cat out. He said something like, "Honey, there hasn't been a cat that lived here in 3 years." I told him I was certain I'd just seen a cat walking across the tops of the shelves. We sat in that room for his visit, just so he could prove to me that there was no living cat there. Last story. Once again on the med-surg floor, there was a call light in a hallway that was no longer used, which would ring from time to time. We would always just cancel it out at the nurse's station and blame it on the ghost. Well, one night it rang, and I guess I was feeling brave, so I marched down there, determined to catch a glimpse of the ghost in the room. I swung the door open. A figure sat up slowly from the bed. It turned out that it was an out-of-town lady from the transplant team, waiting for someone who was on life support to be taken off because he was a donor. I seriously thought I was going to faint while I saw the ghost sit up in the bed. This is an account of something weird that happened to my mom when she was a kid. The first thing you should know before reading the story is that my mom is Korean. Back in her generation, many houses were still made of brick and cheap materials. My mom's childhood home was a typical one for that time, spacious, with 2 rooms, one for the living room and kitchen, and one for the bedroom where all the family members slept on the floor. One toilet outside the house, and the entire place surrounded by a wall made of stones stacked high onto each other. My mom's family was relatively poor back then, as nearly everyone else was at that time. So nearly everything that my mom, her 2 younger sisters, and younger brother owned was second-hand or made out of scraps by my grandmother. One day, their mother, my grandma, made a doll out of an old national flag that they owned. A little rag doll with a smile stitched into its face. My mom hated it at first sight. It was ugly, and the buttons for eyes and the white grin on its face were creepy in her opinion. A few days passed without anything happening, but my mother always felt like she was being watched during those days. She shrugged it off, thinking she was being silly, but she never stayed in the same room as the doll without someone else present. Then she started having nightmares. In her dreams, she would see the doll moving by itself. She would hide from it as it wandered around. It would leave the living room where it had been left and open the door to their sleeping space, staring at the sleeping bodies of her family and herself. Every morning, my mom would wake up with chills down her spine. But again, she ignored the ominous feeling that crept in each night, always seeing the same dream of the doll moving and giggling. After all, her parents were the no-nonsense sort, and she thought they would have little patience for the seemingly overactive imagination of a little girl. But then one night, the dream changed. The doll was no longer wandering around inside the house. Instead, it went outside, dragging a hammer with it. As it clumsily stepped toward the wall surrounding the house, it then started hitting the stone wall. Crack after crack, the grinning doll continued to hit the wall until my mom woke up. The dream scared her. The previous dreams had been creepy but bearable, but now the doll was actually breaking something. She had a sinking feeling that the doll was not as harmless and innocent as it looked. She couldn't stand it anymore, so she told her siblings and their mother about her dreams. Luckily, my grandmother was surprisingly superstitious, for someone who seemed to take things very seriously. In Korea, dreams, as well as other spiritual aspects of our lives, were taken quite seriously. Even today, many Korean shamans are somewhat feared and respected. Later that night, the family left the doll locked in the bedroom so that it couldn't get to the wall while they camped out in the living room with candles lit. They fell asleep. Then they woke up to a loud crash from the room next to them. It was early in the morning when it was still dark outside. My grandmother quickly unlocked the bedroom door, only to see the room in shambles. The bedroom wall had caved in. Chillingly, it was the wall that had faced a part of the stone wall that the doll had been smashing in her dream. The section of the outside wall closest to their bedroom had somehow broken off, with the heavy stones crashing into the wooden wall of the bedroom. The stones had fallen to where, if the family had not relocated, they would have crushed her and her family to death. More creepily, although everything in the room had been crushed, broken, and covered in dust, the doll remained as pristine and smiling as it always had, in the corner of the room facing the wall next to the living room. It could have been a coincidence. The wall could have been worn down from the weather, and a strong burst of wind could have knocked it over. But that didn't explain why she had been plagued by the doll in her dreams, why the wall would suddenly fall the night after she dreamed of the doll hitting it, nor how the doll managed to get to the corner opposite to where they had stationed it before locking the room. That day, my grandmother tossed the doll into a fire. When I moved in, I knew immediately something was up. They acted way too nice. I have read that renting from couples can be strange because they have a very specific way of living, and any disruption to that balance might lead to unpredictable reactions. After 4 weeks of living there, I noticed that they still hadn't fully moved in. We had arrived around the same time, and though they were 2 people, and I was only 1, it was hard not to notice the myriad of boxes and belongings flying around. Eventually, I started looking up the telltale signs of hoarders. They definitely fit the bill, and the stuff began to pile up. They have piles of random items all over the house now, and food everywhere. I have never seen so much food in a house. Their cupboards are always filled to bursting with junk food. They have more than a few 24 packs of soda and energy drinks scattered in the garage, on the deck, in the basement, on the dining room floor, in the kitchen, in the living room, everywhere. Their fridge and freezer are always completely filled, sometimes overflowing, with the most random foods, not typical items like frozen pizzas, sandwich ingredients, or leftovers, either. I'm talking elk sausages, 15 different types of cheese, more almond milk than one could imagine, and loads of garlic, stuff like that. Besides an overstocked fridge and freezer, they have a box freezer in the garage that's filled to the brim and takes up most of the space that's supposed to be mine. They also have tons of beer in my fridge, usually about 9 or so 6-packs. They have garbage lying in the living room all the time, too. Sometimes 3 or 4 copies of every movie they own. And they constantly have a lot of dishes in the sink. They had to order secondary garbage and recycling bins for the street because they have so much to throw out. All of this, and they can't hold a conversation. Whenever I talk to them, the conversation always devolves into teasing and insults directed at me. I have to make up an excuse to leave the room, or else they'll just keep going for an hour or more. They'll tease the way I talk, which is pretty normal, the way I walk through the house, the clothes I wear, t-shirts and jeans or sweatpants. They twist every conversation we have into a way to make fun of me or whoever they're talking to. It's creepy, to say the least. I started researching their behaviors, hoping to get some insight into why they might act the way they do. I found an article on narcissism that perfectly defines my landlady, and more than a few posts about PTSD that make my landlord look like a cookie-cutter person, fitting perfectly into that category. I still haven't figured out why they hoard so much stuff, but I'm working on it. But hey, maybe you're not convinced. Well, here's the kicker. After a couple of months, I started hearing the stairs leading down to my part of the house creak a lot. You have to walk down the stairs and turn a sharp corner to get to where I live, so you can't see the stairs until you're right in front of them. Then I started to overhear them gossip about me when they would eat in the living room. I also noticed that certain things were moved in my bathroom or bedroom. I keep an air circulation fan on pretty much all the time because I live underground, and the place gets musty if I don't leave the fan on. But I would find it turned off after getting back from work or something. Or I would find that a light had been left on that I was sure I had turned off. So I got a couple of tiny cameras, planted one across from the stairs and one in my room. Turns out my landlady had been eavesdropping on my phone calls by going halfway down the stairs and just listening and rummaging around my room. She wouldn't take anything, just rearranging my books and movies, flipping through my personal documents, trying to access my computer, looking through my trash, checking the pockets of my coats, testing my power outlets. Once she even played a video game. She would also use my bathroom, I thought about it for a week and decided to do nothing. Just keep the footage on a flash drive and wait until I move somewhere safe to do something with it. Maybe show them or show the police, or both. Probably both. We share a stove, and whenever I cook, I can see them peeking at me around the corner. My landlady has very loud phone conversations with her mother, where she yells and screams, calling her a derogatory name. My landlord sleepwalks. They leave leftover food on the counters overnight, sometimes for days at a time, before cleaning it up. They installed very high-tech keypad locks on every door in the house. I'm talking really expensive, high-quality stuff, despite living in a neighborhood with the lowest crime rates in the whole city. They lie about me constantly to each other, talking openly in areas of the house where they know I can hear them. They blame every household accident on me, even ones that happen in their private areas of the house. This is random, but I noticed that they have no wall art or decorations at all. They own exactly 26 rolls of duct tape, as I found out after trying to find a hammer in the garage. And of course, no strange couple would be complete without a secret room that only the landlord has a key to. They told me never, ever to go back there, even though I can't possibly get the door open without an axe. They never told me anything about themselves. They asked me tons of personal questions while I moved in, but they wouldn't answer any of mine back. I found out from my landlady's mother that my landlady is adopted and used to be a teacher, but is now a nurse. And my landlord is an ex-US Marine who works on the computer from home. Not even she knows what his actual job is. Why do I still live here, you ask? The rent is cheap, and I'm very poor. Also, the neighborhood is right next to a bunch of shopping centers and restaurants, which is great for someone like me who has no car. Why am I sharing all this? I have to get it off my chest, and I'm too scared to tell anyone I know. One last thing, whenever I would do something like forget to lock the door, leave crumbs on the counter, even though they leave crazy messes in the kitchen every day, or accidentally put a pizza box in the recycling bin, they would both say the exact same thing. We legitimately hurt you. Stop doing that. Those words exactly, every time from both of them. It didn't matter which one told me. They would both say the same thing in the same way. It creeped me out. Now they have a baby who is usually at its grandparents' house, and my landlady told me that if I ever wake up the baby, she'll have to kill me. Am I scared of them and the way they live? Yes. Am I looking for somewhere else to live? Yes, always. I just walked in on a psycho breaking into my mother's house. I'm a 14-year-old male. My mom's house is across the street from my dad's house. I live at my dad's house. About a week or so ago, I bought myself a PlayStation 5. It seemed like a great idea at the time, but after I realized that I needed Wi-Fi for the majority of its functions, I was pretty disappointed in myself. My dad doesn't have internet, but my mom does. With that out of the way, I'll tell the bulk of my story. My friend recently bought Far Cry 6. I don't have the money for that, so he said we could game share. Basically, I get the game off of him without buying it, and I could get it for free. It was around 10:30 at night when I unplugged my PS5 to take it over to my mom's house to begin downloading the game. I brought one of my pocket knives with me because it was dark outside, and I'm an avid listener of scary stories, always preparing for the worst. Thank God I did today. It was a short walk to my mom's house, less than 2 minutes. I opened the door. Inside, my mom was downtown celebrating her friend's birthday, and she had a bad habit of keeping the door unlocked. I made a mental note to scold her about it later. Before I walked in, I turned to look over at the living room where I saw him. Some old man was sitting in my mom's recliner, just reading a book. He looked strange. He didn't look like a drifter, but his eyes had this crazy look that I'll never forget, like they were detached from reality. And he stank like a body covered in spoiled milk. I could smell it from across the room. He turned to look at me, and I felt my blood run cold. He just smiled at me and closed the book. He stared at me like that for a few minutes, before standing up and opening his arms as if he wanted a hug. "I'm a visitor," he spoke. His voice sounded as crazy as his eyes looked. That's when I snapped out of my state and ran out of my mom's house, running as fast as I could to my dad's house, thanking God for lacrosse conditioning. I made it there in less than a minute, remember. My dad's house is right across the street from my mom's, literally. I quickly entered my dad's house and shut the door, locking both locks before running around the house, locking every window and covering them with the blinds. I placed my PS5, which I had held onto when I ran stupid, down on the couch before dialing the police and telling them the details of what happened. I was told to stay on the line with the dispatcher, and I did. She told me to go into my room and lock the door. I took my dogs inside the room with me and locked the door. Now my bed is in the middle of my room, and the head of my bed is right underneath the window. I stupidly sat up against the window, wanting to see my whole room. I removed my knife from my pocket and opened it up, holding it tightly in my hands as I sat in panicked silence. Suddenly, my older dog, Max, looked at me and started to growl. I was confused before I realized that he wasn't growling at me. He was growling at my window. Suddenly, I heard a loud crashing noise as the crazy man broke my window open, probably with a bat or stick from my backyard. I felt his arm wrap around my neck as he started dragging me through my broken window, the shards of glass cutting into my skin. I slashed and stabbed my knife behind me blindly. I heard the man curse in pain as his grip loosened. I stabbed his arm a couple of times before wriggling myself from his grasp. My dogs jumped out of my window and began to attack the man. The police ran into my backyard. I grabbed my dogs by their collars and pulled them back. I wanted to let them attack the man. I wanted to let them kill him, but I didn't want them to get in the way of the officers. The man was cuffed and placed into the patrol car. They asked me a few questions before they sent me to call my dad, as he was also out at dinner. They took me to the hospital, and I got the more severe cuts stitched up. They sent me back to my house maybe an hour ago. I started typing this almost right after I got home, around 12:30 a.m. Some closing thoughts. I want to tell everyone reading to lock their doors. These things can happen to anyone. The world is full of horrible people, and you may just be their next victim if your door is unlocked when you're not home or asleep. I also want to thank the officers and the dispatcher that I talked to. The dispatcher helped keep me calm, and the officers got the man cuffed and in the car quickly. and were very kind to me when asking me questions. I was renting a cottage in northern Oregon at the time. The neighborhood was rural enough to have space, yet close enough to neighbors to feel safe. There were no streetlights, making nights incredibly dark, especially on cloudy evenings when the moon couldn't break through. One evening in mid-January, I arrived home from work. The night was particularly cloudy, and I could only see what my headlights and porch light illuminated. As I stepped out of my car, I caught a whiff of cigar smoke. Strange, since I'd never smelled that around my house before. I looked around but saw no one, so I shrugged it off and went inside. I had just finished a grueling shift with several hours of overtime, so I was exhausted despite it being only 7:00 p.m. I decided to take a quick shower and turn in early. I woke up later, startled by a noise inside my house. At first, I wasn't too concerned. My friend occasionally stopped by to use my shower after work on his way to evening classes. I had given him a spare key so he could drop by when I wasn't home, but he always texted beforehand, and I hadn't heard my phone. Reaching for my phone on the bedside table, I checked if he had messaged me. The bright screen temporarily blinded me. Phones back then didn't have light sensors to adjust brightness automatically, and mine was bright enough to use as a flashlight. Squinting, I saw it was just past 9:00 p.m., but couldn't tell if I had any messages. Setting the phone aside, I called out my friend's name. After a few seconds of silence, I heard heavy footsteps pounding through the first floor of my house. I leapt out of bed and dashed to my closet. By the time I opened the door and stepped inside, whoever was in my house had already started up the stairs. The house had 3 rooms upstairs, 2 bedrooms on either side of the hallway, and a bathroom at the end. Both bedroom doors were closed, but the bathroom door was slightly ajar. I heard the intruder thunder down the hallway past my door and into the bathroom. This gave me just enough time to open the attic access in the closet ceiling and start hoisting myself up. As I was pulling my feet into the attic, I heard them storm out of the bathroom. My bedroom door burst open moments later. I froze, crouched in the attic just a foot or so above the access hatch, ready to defend myself if they tried to climb up. From my vantage point, I could only see them from the knees down. They wore dirty jeans with frayed cuffs and worn work boots. After searching my closet for a few seconds, they stepped away. Then I heard a loud crash from my room, followed by a scream of frustration. That scream chilled me to the bone. It was unnerving yet oddly familiar, reminiscent of my stepbrother's outbursts when he lost his temper. He had eventually been committed to a psychiatric facility due to various disorders that caused erratic and violent behavior. The intruder ran back downstairs. I heard crashes and clatters as things were thrown around and furniture overturned. I remained crouched in the attic. I had left my cell phone behind when I ran for the closet, and I wasn't certain I could climb down without being heard. After some time, the noises stopped. I started counting slowly, and when I reached 1,000, I decided it was safe enough to climb down and call the police. The first thing I noticed upon exiting the closet was that the intruder had flipped my bed over, presumably trying to find me. That explained the loud noise I'd heard after he stepped away from the closet. Unable to find my cell phone, I went to the landline by the bed and called the police. I waited in my room until I heard them call out from downstairs. The first floor was a mess, as expected. Chairs had been knocked over, the sofa flipped. All the books, pictures, and knickknacks from my shelves were strewn across the floor. The kitchen cabinets had been opened, and all the boxed and canned foods thrown to the ground. As far as I could tell, though, the only thing missing was a single knife from the wooden block in my kitchen. The police checked the house from top to bottom. They found that the side door had been forced open with something like a crowbar. They also found cigar butts along my fence line, along with foil and an empty pen tube, which the police said people often use to smoke illicit substances. They believed he had been watching my house for a while. I realized he must have been out there smoking when I got home. The police collected the evidence and advised me to stay with family or friends that night and get the door fixed as soon as possible. I opted to just not sleep. I moved a shelf to block the broken door and spent the next couple of hours cleaning things up. I would occasionally go to the window with a flashlight and shine it along the fence line where the police found the cigar butts and foil. But I never saw anything. The next day, I called to have the door fixed and motion lights installed at the back and sides of my house. I ran a phone cable up into the attic and added a landline. I never wanted to be stuck up there without a phone again. Nothing else happened at that house, though I lived there another 3 years without incident. One precaution I took was practicing getting out of my bed, going to my closet, and climbing into the attic as quickly and quietly as possible. I still practice escape routes even now, though instead of an attic, I go to a crawl space at the back of my closet. I try not to think about what would have happened if I'd been a bit slower getting to the attic, or if he hadn't gone into the bathroom first. This past Monday, my coworkers and I returned to our hotel after a day of work out in the field. Rachel and I walked to our rooms, and as we stood outside, I opened mine and saw someone in the bathroom. I said hello, but nobody answered. My first instinct was that it was housekeeping in there for some reason. And then I saw my bag with my clothes in her hands. I said to my coworker, "There's a woman in my room." Then I asked the woman, "What are you doing with my stuff?" It gets a little fuzzy here because I can't remember everything I said and what she said, but she kept mumbling about how her key still worked, how it still worked, and that's how she got in. I was in shock, and she was obviously very flustered, having been caught mid-robbery. She dropped my bags and fumbled around with her purse and a white plastic bag. By this time, my coworker was behind me, watching all the insanity unfold. This woman was scrambling and walking toward the door, and I said, "What's in the bag?" thinking it was probably my stuff. She said, No, it's just my things." "It's just my things." "I'll show you," and she did. I looked and didn't see anything of mine, and since I was obviously in shock at the time, I let her leave. I went into my room, and it had been ransacked. I did a quick check to see if anything had been taken. All of my electronics were still there. Then I went into the bathroom and saw my underwear, my swimsuit, and my clothes shoved into my own bags randomly. Even my passport was shoved in there. Then I looked on the counter and saw that she had gotten into my medication. I'm not sure what was going through my head at the moment other than I wanted it back. So I ran out the door to find her. I ran to the laundry room downstairs and out to the sides of the hotel, but I didn't see her. I realized I was never going to find her, so my coworker and I went down to the lobby to tell them what happened, and then we called the police. We went back up to my room to wait, and I noticed there was a metal bat on my bed, a little larger than one of those novelty wooden bats you can get at a baseball game, but with a flashlight on the end. She must have left it behind in her hurry. She also left behind a necklace that must have fallen out of her bag when she was scrambling with mine. I was mostly freaking out at this point, because I thought she had gotten away with my medication that I need. The police arrived, took our statements, and looked around the room. One thing I noticed was that there were bits of drywall in the sink, and I pointed that out to the officers, but none of us really knew where it came from. We started looking at the door and the windows to see if she had pried her way in somehow, but there was nothing. So we kind of just went with the idea that she had a spare key or something, even though the hotel front desk adamantly stated there was no way that could be the case. The officer who came brought 2 more officers as backup because they thought the woman might still be in the vicinity. But after our statements were taken, there was nothing else they could really do, so they left. I sat down to finally make some calls, and as I'm on the phone, I'm thinking about the drywall in the sink, and it still didn't make sense to me. So I'm on the phone and looking at the drywall and the mirror on the wall right above it, and then it hit me. I got my coworker and asked her to help me pull at the mirror on the wall. We took the mirror down, and there was a hole there, just big enough for someone desperate to squeeze through. I asked Rachel if I should call the cops again to let them know I found this, and she said there were still 2 cop cars in the parking lot, so I went down to tell them. The female officer kind of rolled her eyes, but the man said, "I'll come check it out." They both came back up, looked in the hole, and found a pillow, blankets, cigarettes, clothes, toothbrushes. This woman had been living in the wall behind my mirror for who knows how long. She had access to me in my room at all times. I know it might be hard to picture. There was a crawl space about 2 feet wide between the 2 rows of rooms. One of the officers called the original officer to come back and take pictures. She explained to him what was going on, and all I hear over the radio is, "No way." He came back, took pictures, and was just as mind-blown as the rest of us. Obviously, we packed up and left immediately. What's even crazier is, she had probably been there a long time. The last time we stayed at this hotel, I would randomly smell cigarette smoke and assume someone was smoking in their bathroom, and it was traveling through the vents. But nope, a person was smoking just on the other side of my mirror. She had access to other rooms too. The holes in the walls were from a renovation, and the hotel hadn't properly patched them. They had just covered them up with mirrors. She could have been hanging out in people's rooms when they were gone. Anyway, this was insane, and I'm taking a little time off. I grew up in the countryside right next to a wildlife preserve frequently visited by nature lovers and bird enthusiasts. It was the kind of park where you're not really allowed to bike or ride horses, only walk or run. But 10-year-old me thought it was a stupid rule, and did so anyway because the trails were perfect for it. I knew full well that I wasn't supposed to do that. I was caught a few times, but nothing much came of it apart from a half-hearted "don't do it again." And I did, of course, until one day something frightening happened that made me stop. My family were horse breeders, and I would often take one of the horses for a ride, usually in the Forbidden Park. This day, very early in the morning on the first day of summer break, it was beautiful outdoors, misty and foggy, with a sky that promised a sunny day ahead. Since it was so early, before 6:00 a.m., I knew there wouldn't be anyone on the trail to see me. So I let the horse set off at full speed along the trail. I only slowed down on the part of the trail that got steep on one side, leading down to the river, because the thought of one step too close to the edge was too much, even for a kid with next to no risk assessment skills. Suddenly, the horse came to a halt and refused to take another step. I grew up with horses all my life and knew that usually this indicates that you need to investigate. Is there something with the hooves? Did the horse spot something that spooked it? The hooves were fine, but the horse didn't move an inch. That's when I saw it. Someone had set up a trap, a thin, sharp metal wire across the trail, at perfect neck height for an adult. I stopped and looked around, but didn't see anyone. The wire was well attached to two smaller trees, and impossible for me to remove. So I led the horse around it. To do so, I had to walk a bit up into the wooded area on the side of the trail. That is when I heard the singing. There's a song called "Hedgehog in the Fog," and it was that melody, but the lyrics were different and sung in a muffled, sneering voice. Today I only remember parts of it, but translated, it would have been something like, "Hey, all you runners, come here passing, let the life-blood pour out." I, as silently as I could and with my heart in my throat, backed away, got up on the horse, and hurried back the way I came as fast as I could. I knew I had to tell someone about it, but at the same time, I wanted to avoid admitting to riding a huge and very forbidden horse on those protected trails. So now I had a problem. The old stories about a mad old man living in the shed in the woods, a shed that was once a cottage for the local hunter, came back to me as I hung on the horse for dear life. I got home and told my older brother what had happened, and he went back there with me in tow. We found the wire trap, and after a while of searching, we also found a spear-like pole in the ground, right on the spot where you'd land if you came running and jumped over the fallen trees on the trail. That's when we called the police. The area was searched, and several similar traps were found, but there was no sign of the old man. The following summer, though, there were big news in the local paper about spear-like poles being found right under the water surface, directly under that little tower you're supposed to dive from at the lake. And black garbage bags filled with big rocks were found on the narrow bridge crossing the river, so that if a car had hit it, there was a risk it would have gone off the road and into the water. This happened a year ago, and I'm still pretty shaken by the whole event. I thought I'd share my story. I live in the UK, and in autumn it gets dark at around 4:00 p.m. There was a school break that week, so all the kids were at home, including my girlfriend's brother. I'd been with her for a year at that point, so her family knew me pretty well, and her brother enjoyed my company. She'd recently been pretty stressed out. Her parents were traveling across the country for the day, so she had to look after her brother. To give her a break and some time for herself, I offered to take care of her brother for the day, and her parents agreed. I arrived at their house at 8:00 a.m., and they let me in before heading out. Her brother woke up about an hour later, followed shortly by my girlfriend. We went out for breakfast at a local cafe together, and after we were done, I dropped her off back at the house and took her brother to the park. We got to the park around 2:00 p.m., and it was packed with people. As the sun started setting, the place gradually emptied, and by 4:00 p.m., it was completely deserted. I texted my girlfriend to let her know we'd be home soon, and she replied, "Okay." Honestly, I lost track of time. Her brother and I were having fun, enjoying the empty park. We were standing on top of a tall climbing frame with a slide when I realized it was almost pitch black. I used my phone as a flashlight while I was holding it. A notification popped up from my girlfriend asking where we were. I quickly replied, "Oops, coming home now," and told her brother it was time to leave. He sighed and asked if we could go down the slide one last time. I agreed. Before going down the slide, I took a mental note of the park. It was surrounded by street lights, benches, trees, and various play structures. When I came out of the slide, something strange caught my eye. A man had appeared out of nowhere, standing under one of the street lights. He wore a trench coat and a beanie hat. I immediately got my girlfriend's brother behind me and cautiously called out to the man with a friendly, "Hi there." He responded by groaning. He was swaying back and forth under the light, his mouth open, drooling, and his eyes had a blank stare. The whole scene made me feel extremely uneasy. I picked up her brother and kept an eye on the man while heading toward the exit, which led to the path home. As I walked away, I kept glancing over my shoulder. The man was still standing there. The path I used merged with a larger main path. Unfortunately, so did the path I was on. After walking for about 2 minutes, periodically checking behind me, I thought we were in the clear. We weren't. I was on a straight stretch of path with lots of street lights when I saw him again. He was standing beneath one, looking up at it, and he was playing with something in his hands. I looked closer and realized it was a knife. I kept walking and checking behind me constantly. My girlfriend's little brother was so scared. He had his head tucked into my chest. I noticed that the man seemed to be moving to new street lights whenever I turned around. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me, but I started counting them and realized 2 street lights behind him had definitely turned into 5. I could faintly hear a groaning noise, and he was occasionally moaning as well. I picked up the pace and turned a corner, entering the last stretch of street before reaching my girlfriend's house. That's when I heard him behind the row of bushes. The moaning noise sounded angry, and I heard heavy footsteps bounding down the path. The man was running. I immediately broke into a sprint and didn't stop until I reached an alleyway near the front of the street and got behind my girlfriend's house. There's a big bush there, so I crouched down and spammed her phone with messages asking her to open the back gate. I clutched her brother close until she opened it. It felt like years. I went to the front of the house and confirmed that I had managed to shake him. He was now in the street, circling where I had been just moments ago outside the alleyway. He was still moaning and had that knife in his hand. He started kicking over people's bins. I called the police immediately, but he was gone by the time they arrived. As far as I know, they never found him. There was a similar incident near the area a few months ago, which I saw in a local Facebook group. But I don't think anything came of that either. Her parents thanked me for keeping their son safe and didn't hold any grudge against me for the situation. He went back to normal pretty much the day after, but he still has nightmares about the event. When my country isn't in lockdown, I'm still allowed to look after him with my girlfriend, funnily enough. But we haven't been to that park since, and I still check over my shoulder and break into a cold sweat every time I'm alone in the street. A few months ago, I was out hiking with my friend. We lived in the mountains of Western Canada, and we were about 6 miles into an 8-mile loop we have done frequently when we decided to take some pictures and eat a snack at a summit. This area of the trail had a few park benches, tables, and a parking lot. We were sitting and talking when I noticed a man just walking around the parking lot alone. He was walking aimlessly, staring at his feet. What confused me was that he was in jeans and a button-down shirt, not exactly hiking attire. We decided to set off on the last 2-mile leg of the loop. This part goes downhill to the headquarters of the park and is cut out of the mountain bank. The end of that leg is the parking lot where our car is. You don't have a lot of visibility from the trail, and you have to walk single file. I was walking in front, talking to my friend. I turned to look at her and saw the same man right behind her, following at an uncomfortably close distance. I immediately got a gut-wrenching feeling. I noticed that he didn't have any pack or hiking gear and was not even wearing boots. Something about his eyes really spooked me, so we continued walking, and he kept following very closely. I said to my friend that I had to tie my shoe as a reason to step off the trail and let him pass us, in case he was only following closely because he wanted to go faster than we were. She immediately caught onto what I was doing, and we pulled over. He looked startled, and she said hello politely. He just stared. This is when I noticed that he was carrying a stick. As I was fiddling with my shoe, she stood between us and he passed us. We waited to give him some distance ahead of us, but he immediately slowed down. We waited a bit longer, and when he reached the furthest part of the trail that had sightlines to us, he turned around, looking up at us. We decided that something felt too wrong about this guy, and we didn't want to have to pass him again. So we turned around and walked back up the trail toward the park with the tables and parking. A few minutes into walking up the trail, I looked back and saw him walking up the trail too. He was following us. I told my friend to walk faster. We hurried up the trail and got to the parking lot area we were at before. We started to strategize and wait, deciding that we would wait to see if he came back up the trail to the lot. There were more people around here, so we felt safer waiting it out. About 20 minutes went by and nothing. We were talking about how that could mean he kept going on the trail and was long gone, or was waiting on the trail where it was more deserted. We saw a couple come up from the trail where we were, presumably taking the loop in the opposite direction. We approached them and asked if they had seen anyone on the trail between this lot and the next. They told us they saw a young man sitting on a rock about halfway down. They described the man who had been following us. We explained our interaction with him to the wife. and got into a conversation back and forth about whether or not he was a threat. The husband finally interjected and said, "We need to call a ranger." He wasn't just sitting there, he had a knife and was carving that stick. Needless to say, we called a ranger. The nice couple walked the last leg with us to make sure we got to our car safely. And they even gave us their numbers in case we needed anything. The rangers then walked the trail, but there was no sign of him. I wish I knew where he went and what happened to him, but I'm glad to know that my instincts were legitimate. I was driving to work at about 3:30 a.m. I usually take 3 different routes to work, but I've been using the same one for a while since there's construction everywhere else. The road I take runs between subdivisions on either side. I was listening to a podcast, trying to stay awake until I could grab some coffee. As I drove, I started feeling uneasy. At first, I thought my body was just telling me I needed caffeine and maybe something to eat, so I ignored it and kept going. All of a sudden, a man ran into the middle of the road. I barely saw him because he was wearing dark clothes. I managed to slow down and noticed that he looked terrified. Now I listen to a lot of creepy podcasts, ranging from true crime to the supernatural. I know the rules for staying safe in strange situations, and I wish I had followed them that day. Normally, I wouldn't stop, but I thought about what I would want someone to do if I were in trouble, so I stopped. Luckily, I kept my car running and only rolled my window down a little so I could talk to him. I asked if he was okay. He started panicking, saying someone was trying to kill him. He explained that his dog had been ripped apart in his front yard, and when he went to pick up the remains to bury them, he saw a man running at him with a knife. At first, he thought it might have been a coyote or something, but once he saw the man, he ran. His story was disturbing, but something didn't sit right with me. It was dark, but the lights inside my car and the subdivision lights outside gave me a clear view of him. He looked to be in his mid-30s with dark black hair and green eyes. He wore a hunter's jacket and jeans, which is pretty normal attire for Idaho. What stood out was that there wasn't any blood or fur on him. I asked why there wasn't any blood on him, and his entire demeanor changed. It was like flipping a switch. My blood ran cold. He stared at me for what felt like hours, though it was probably just a few seconds. Then he spoke, and what he said was the final straw for me. His body relaxed, he stopped shaking, and he leaned closer to my window. He smiled a twisted, chilling smile, and his eyes seemed to darken. He took a deep breath and said, "I was going to help you." Then he started cackling. He tried to open my car door. I immediately rolled up my window, threw the car into drive, and sped off down the road. I didn't stop for anything. When I finally got to work, I broke down and started crying. I had 10 minutes before my shift started, but I was too terrified to get out of my car. I F-52 at the time, was traveling by car to an out-of-town job assignment. I had stopped at a popular and busy gas station. Okay, it was a pilot to fill up the car, use the restroom, and grab a snack. I was approached by a developmentally disabled woman who appeared to be in her mid-20s. She was looking for a ride to a town a couple of towns over. Her ride had abandoned her while she was in the restroom. She was a little upset. She didn't have a cell phone and didn't know any phone numbers, so I couldn't call someone for her. I checked with the employees at the store, and they said that she had been there for an hour looking for a ride because she said her friends left her while she was in the restroom. I then made the decision to do something I've never done before: offer a stranger a ride. I wasn't going to the town she wanted to go to, but I was heading in that direction, and I told her I could drop her off at the grocery store in the next town, where I would be turning off to go to my destination. The grocery store was always busy, and it was very likely she'd have an easier time getting a ride to where she wanted to go. Also, she'd be 5 miles away from where she wanted to go instead of 25 miles, and she'd have an easier time walking that distance if she had to. This was agreeable to her, and we set off. Right away, I noticed a van following us. I tried to lose the van, but it kept pace. Meanwhile, the woman wanted to play with my phone. I told her no, it wasn't a toy, it was for work, and I moved it out of her reach. The van sped up and started to get closer. The woman suddenly remembered her boyfriend's phone number, and she said we needed to call him. I couldn't use my phone while driving. This was precinct voice-activated operation, and I was approaching the outskirts of the business district of the next town, with no cell phone use while driving, signs everywhere. I told her, "We're almost to the grocery store. We can call him from the parking lot." She became agitated and yelled, "No. You have to take me home." I told her, "I can't do that. I'm not going there. It's in the opposite direction of where I need to go, and I'm expected soon. We'll call him from the parking lot." She became more upset and frustrated. The van was getting closer. I pulled into the grocery store parking lot. It was about 4:00 p.m. The grocery store was busy. I pulled up in front of the store and asked for her boyfriend's number. She couldn't remember his number. She wouldn't get out of the car. She was arguing with me, and the van was pulling into the parking lot. There was a sheriff's deputy parked nearby, and I rolled down my window and signaled that I needed to speak to him. He walked over and asked me what was going on. I told him where I met the woman and how she wouldn't get out of the car. Under my breath, I told him the van had been following us. The deputy told the woman, "She brought you where you asked her to. It's time for you to leave her car now." She slowly got out of the car, and I asked once more for her boyfriend's number. She said, "You're crazy. I don't have a boyfriend. Oh, look, there are my friends now," and she pointed to the van. The deputy and I shared a look, and he said, "Give me your contact info. I can delay them for about 20 minutes while I check their license and registration, and lecture them about abandoning a special needs adult. You get out of here, and I'll check on you before my shift is over. And don't pick up any more hitchhikers." I left and went on to my destination. He called me to make sure I got to where I was going, and told me that they were keeping an eye on the van and its owner. He also said he contacted a colleague at the sheriff's department in the county where I was working, and she would contact me in a day or two while I was on assignment there. I spoke to 2 deputies and a detective about the woman and the van. No one ever told me anything about them, but they were very interested in them. My nightmare is one day I'll turn on a true crime show and see a report about this woman and her gang robbing and killing people. This occurred in 2015. I was 22 years old and leaving my home state of California to head east for my corrections job. I was driving down the loneliest highway portion of the route, and it was around 3:00 a.m. on a Sunday. They don't call it the loneliest highway for nothing. I hadn't seen another soul for at least half an hour. I was getting sleepy, but I wasn't tired enough to pull over and take a nap. When I saw a broken down car on the side of the highway, I slowed down and saw a woman standing next to the car. I approached her with caution, rolling down my window just a sliver. Something about her wasn't right. I couldn't put my finger on it then, but now I know it was my subconscious screaming, "Red flag, red flag." I asked her if she needed me to call a tow truck or AAA for her, and she immediately tried to open my door. I explained to her that I didn't feel comfortable letting her in, but I'd wait until a tow truck came. She immediately got this look of rage on her face and started berating me. "You're a big man. What am I going to do to you?" she said, accusing me of being cruel for not letting her in. This is where I messed up. I can see this now, 10 years later. I begrudgingly unlocked my door, figuring she was right. She was at most 52. And I'm over 6 ft tall with at least 100 pounds over her. She looked to be about 90 pounds. She slipped in and I asked her who I could call. This was 10 years ago, so I had a little BlackBerry slide phone, I think, at the time. She started telling me that she'd just prefer if I gave her a ride to the next town. Now I'm starting to realize I really messed up. She was avoiding eye contact and fumbling in her purse. And when I mentioned calling for help, she got aggressive, demanding I take her to the next town. I was so focused on trying to fix the situation that I completely missed a man who had been either hiding in or near her car. It wasn't until he was almost at my driver's side door that I caught him in my rearview mirror. Fight or flight kicked in. I put my car in drive and sped off just as the guy was reaching for my car door. I sped away and heard a ping noise, and then my rearview mirror exploded. He was shooting at me. The adrenaline alone had me doing nearly 90. And by this time, the woman realized, likely in whatever substance-induced stupor she was in, that her little plan was futile. She started hitting me, yelling at me to stop and let her out. When I reached a safe enough distance, I did just that. I pulled over and demanded she get out. She started going for the oversized purse she had, but I had enough. I was literally shaking with adrenaline. I reached over, opened the door, and pretty much shoved her out. I tried grabbing her purse, but she managed to hold on to it, not before dumping half of what was in it onto my passenger seat. I sped off, my door still open. I waited until I got a good distance away, then slammed it shut and locked it. I clenched the wheel and drove almost on autopilot. It wasn't until later that morning, when I pulled into a Denny's, that I realized how close I came to dying. I had a good cry, and then noticed a bunch of her things spilled onto my passenger seat. Most of it was nasty wadded-up napkins, a few tubes of lipstick, and substance paraphernalia. I considered calling the cops or finding a highway patrol officer, but I did something stupid. I tossed all her things into a trash bag and threw them away. At the time, I had dreams of becoming a cop, and I knew if I got caught with paraphernalia, that dream would be over. I didn't think anyone would believe it wasn't mine. I noticed a cop at the gas station across from the Denny's and told him what happened. He pretty much berated me for pulling over and letting her in. He said he'd look into it, but I doubt he did. I was so shaken that I picked at my pancakes and left to continue my journey. I never replaced that mirror. I ended up selling my car since where I lived didn't require me to have one. To this day, years later, I hesitate to stop and help stranded motorists. This was back in the 90s, when our only option was a landline phone and dial-up internet. I was around 8 or 9 years old when my mom started leaving me at home with my oldest brother while she went to work. My brother was much older, around 17 at the time. As most teenage boys, his favorite thing to do was sleep really late during the day and stay up all night playing games. I remember being bored, playing with my Barbies in the living room of my house, with the blinds wide open to let some sunlight in and save on electricity. I would sit there for hours and play when Mom was gone. She always told us to answer the phone when it rang, in case she was calling to check on us and make sure we were okay. I remember one day specifically. I answered the phone and just heard loud breathing on the other end of the line. I kept saying hello, but no one would reply. So eventually I would hang up. This went on daily for about 2 months, and it was always in the morning when my brother was asleep. Being a naive 8 to 9-year-old girl, I didn't really think anything of it, and eventually the call stopped. A few months went by, and I was sitting on my living room floor again when the phone rang. I heard the same breathing again and said, "Hello." "Who is this?" To my surprise, a man replied and said, "Hello, kitten. Do you remember me?" I remember being surprised that he called me kitten, but I replied that he had the wrong number. This is where it gets creepy. He then replied, "No, kitten, I have the right number. You're wearing a kitten shirt right now." I remember looking down and immediately panicking and hanging up the phone while I saw the tabby kitten on my shirt. The phone rang again, but I refused to answer it. I ran to wake up my brother, and he sleepily followed me to the living room. The phone rang again, and he answered it, but no one was there. He then unplugged the phone and told me that it was just my imagination and to leave him alone so he could sleep. Being scared, I decided to close the windows and sit on the couch until my mom got home that afternoon. That night, I told my mom what happened, but my brother told her I was making it up and that he didn't see or hear anything. I think my mom believed me, but she just told me to hang up the phone if it wasn't her and to never open the door for a stranger. I agreed and told her I wouldn't. The next day, my mom was off work, and she took me to the store with her. We were walking around when I noticed a man in a long trench coat. I thought the coat was weird, but didn't really think anything else of it. We then ran into one of my mom's friends, who had a daughter my age. My mom and her friend were chatting away, and my friend and I were standing a few feet from them, messing with some birthday cards. We went around to the other side of the cards to look at some displays. Suddenly, the man with the trench coat was right near us, looking at cards too. He then picked up a card, turned to me and my friend and said, "Hello." Being polite, we responded, "Hello." He then started picking up cards, saying he was getting his daughter something, and asked what we liked. My friend pointed to a random card, and he smiled and said that it was nice. He then picked up another card and showed it to us. The card had kittens all over it, and he looked directly at me and said, "I'm sure you like kittens, don't you?" I didn't really know how to respond and remember feeling extremely nervous. He smiled when he saw me getting nervous and said, "Kittens and Barbies." This kicked my fight or flight into action. At the age of 8 to 9, I nervously laughed and said we had to go back to our moms now. The man then reached out and grabbed my arm. My friend took off running around the corner to get my mom. The man tried to pull me to the front of the store, but I kicked him as hard as I could and flew out of his grip. He then got angry and ran out the door about the time that my mom made it over to me. The police were called and a report was filed. To my knowledge, they never found the man, but my mom was extremely paranoid after hearing the link between the phone calls and the incident. She found a new house in the city right over from us, not even a month later. Thankfully, that was the last time I heard from him. This happened while I was 21, female. I'm currently 27. Back then, I believe I made a rookie mistake, but I've since learned my lesson and taken precautions so this doesn't happen again. I'm an avid mountain biker. Ever since I was about 13 or 14, I've always loved riding on the trails. It was good exercise, but I mostly liked to just listen to music and pedal. I never tried to time myself on a particular trail or anything. All I really did was keep track of my miles. I remember this one day in particular. It may sound a tad bit far-fetched, so I welcome skepticism with open arms. I'm simply trying to get this off my chest, and hopefully it's a wake-up call for anyone who was as trusting as I was. I decided to go on a day ride at this one spot. I had been there before, but it wasn't one of my go-to trails, so I wasn't super familiar with it. I was familiar enough with it, though, to where I would be okay going down the trails I had done in the past. So upon getting there, I was getting my pack ready. I met this one girl who was doing the same. We started talking and hit it off pretty well. At the time, she honestly seemed like someone I could be friends with. She introduced me to her boyfriend, who was also a mountain biker. Once again, no red flags, very friendly. They seemed to have a very healthy relationship. They both seemed to be about my age, give or take. They asked me if I wanted to take a ride with them down their favorite trail. I didn't see any harm in it. Plus, I wanted to learn the area better for potential future rides. The trail was one that I had never been on before. The two of them were also faster than me, like, a lot faster. I never backed down from a challenge. I kept up, albeit probably being about 10 feet behind them the whole time. We stopped briefly to take a water break, and I noticed that the girl had strategically left her backpack open, like, she closed it, but then opened it back up a little bit. Seemed harmless then, but makes more sense now. Without any sort of warning, and while I was taking a pee break in the trees, the two of them started laughing and took off. I was in a compromised position, so I had to hurry up and finish to be able to catch them. By the time I made it back to my bike, they were both completely out of sight. Not to mention, both of my tires had been slashed. I was stranded. I sat down for about 10 minutes to decide what I was going to do. The sun was at its peak, and I remember feeling extremely lightheaded, though I'm pretty sure this was related to shock. I grabbed my bike and started walking down the trail. After about 15 minutes of walking, I came across a wire on the trail. It was tied off to two smaller trees. Had I been riding, that could have easily slit my throat. But the fact that they went through the trouble of slashing my tires made me question this. I hadn't seen them, so this may or may not have been them. Or they could have potentially left it there to try and snare another rider. I honestly don't know, and don't think about that part much anymore. The wire did make the whole thing more frustrating, regardless. I used my Swiss Army knife to remove the wire. I wasn't about to go any further down the trail, so I pushed my bike in the opposite direction. Close to 6 miles later, I made it back to my car. There's a bike rental shop nearby that I stopped at and asked them about the two. I gave them a description, but I wasn't able to provide enough to have them identified. They offered to call the police, but after the day I had, I just wanted to go home. I do regret this, because over the years, I've always wondered if they did this to anyone else. I did feel a level of guilt over this. I've never been back to that trail. I'm still a mountain biker, but I quit going alone since then. Thankfully, my husband is a fellow mountain biker, and I always have a buddy. Please stay safe, everyone, and don't always trust a pretty face. Most scared I've ever been. After my second year in college, I booked an Airbnb for a close friend and me that I had been eyeing for a while. It was an awkward yurt, not a typical stay for me. The yurt was situated on a dirt road 10 minutes from the main road. To get there, it was less of an address and more of a turn right at the two tires stacked, continue for a mile going northwest at the fork. The first night was great. The next day, we explored around town, then returned to our yurt to hang out. I didn't see any neighbors, only homes in the far distance, so given the heat, I felt comfortable wandering topless around our yurt. When night came, I slept in just my underwear. We heard what we assumed to be a distant party early in the night. Loud music was traveling from far away. Sometime during the night, the music stopped, and I fell asleep. A while later, my friend, still awake, heard two men's voices speaking to each other. Their voices got closer and closer until one started shushing the other, and they began talking in whispers. Suddenly, they stopped talking and walked directly up to our yurt, shining a flashlight at the walls. All our belongings were inside, but my car and our shoes, very obviously two women's, were directly outside the yurt. They then turned the flashlight off. Up until this point, I had been asleep, but woke up to what, in my mind, sounded like a stampeding herd of animals growing closer. I remember being in a half-dream, half-awake state, where I genuinely thought there was a galloping animal charging our yurt. What my friend later shared with me was that she was pinching me as hard as she could, and that's how I finally woke up. I never felt the pinch. I remember gasping as I opened my eyes. I was laying on my back in bed. My friend was lying on her side facing me, and she immediately brought her finger to her mouth to shush me. I was now fully awake, but frozen because I had no idea what was going on. We couldn't talk because the desert air carried every sound, every creak of the bed, and I was trying hard to breathe calmly. Since I was on my back, it was difficult to face her without making a sound. So I had my head slightly turned to see what she was whispering. Every minute, the wind would pick up, and all we could hear was the breeze. The next minute, complete silence except for their footsteps in the dirt, slowly walking around us. At one point, they stomped loudly all around our yurt, and I realized that must have been what I thought was the stampeding animals. It got silent again, and just when we thought they must have left, we heard the faintest sound of footsteps encircling us. I'm a very shy, timid person, but my fight or flight kicked in. I wanted to scream as loudly and deeply as I could, "What the hell do you think you're doing?" and yell and fight and kick. My friend was the opposite and told me we need to be absolutely silent. We were communicating on her notes app, with the brightness turned all the way down. When it had been what felt like eternity, she texted 911. The dispatcher was absolutely useless and wouldn't send someone out because we didn't have an address. We kept texting them that we were on a dirt road, and all we had were the directions. We sent them and begged to send someone out. We didn't want the men to know we were on the phone, because the screen's brightness was still bright against the complete darkness. So we gave up on texting. I hated myself for not wearing pajamas, for not having all my self-protection tools under my pillow, and instead in my bag on the floor. I remember completely accepting that I may get stabbed. I thought about what it would be like for my family to find out I'm dead, and how sorry I felt to not explain. I remember in the middle of this eternal frozen state, I heard the zipper rattling, and for the first time, my friend and I broke silence and yelled, "Now!" As if on cue, I leapt to my bag of self-defense items by the door to pull my alarm, sound off my taser, and yelled that 911 was on their way as my friend dialed them on speaker. I remember making ourselves as loud as we could. I remember the distant siren approaching closer, and I remember packing up my belongings quicker than I ever have in my entire life. When a police officer arrived, he waited as we packed our bags into my car. He said we shouldn't be staying so far away from the main road, and we agreed. It was supposed to be just a fun errand. As we were about to pack up our last thing, my friend noticed large footprints in the otherwise perfect sand around our tent. They were inches from the tent, and we hadn't walked up that close because to get that close, you had to step over a circle of rocks decorating the border of our yurt. We only entered through the front door zipper, where the rocks ended. The officer didn't believe it wasn't ours, despite the significantly larger footprints. He said he had been patrolling the area with police dogs, and that was what we must have heard. I hate that I second-guessed myself for the rest of the night, thinking we may have just scared ourselves over nothing. In adrenaline, we made the drive home nonstop. We slept together at my house. I was shaking for the rest of the night, and we both slept with stuffed animals, which at our age was very out of the norm. In the morning, I walked her out to her car to say goodbye. I froze while I got to my car because covering every inch were the largest, muddiest handprints and brown dirt. I consider my brother a big guy, and even his hand was smaller than the handprints on my car. I was so angry the police officer didn't see that, but I was also glad I had proof that someone was there that night. I took so many pictures because I never wanted to forget the image of so many handprints as evidence. The most unsettling part was that my friend shared with me there had been many recent unsolved murders in Wonder Valley within a year before. When she got home, she researched to ease her mind what the area was like and found articles of missing people minutes from our site. I literally recognized every road the articles mentioned as the roads leading to our yurt. I realize you may be thinking nothing horrendous happened to us, but I have never felt that deep in my gut, subconscious, complete acceptance that I may end up dead that night. It was a complete gut feeling, and I don't know how else to describe it. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.